Before we dive into today's stories, I have a quick shout out for the thrill seekers among you. Over on my other channel, Dread Discovers, I dive into the most bewildering and eerie videos the internet has hidden away. Ever watched something and thought, what did I just witness? That's the vibe on Dread Discovers. So, if you're up for content that'll leave you wondering and maybe a bit unsettled, come on over. You can find the link in the description or simply search for Dread Discovers. Trust me, you won't be disappointed. I always loved hearing Graham talk about the Adirondacks. She described them with a sparkle in her eyes, as though she was letting me in on a secret. She made the mountains sound alive, like an old friend she missed dearly. So, when she passed, it just felt right to bring her back to the place she loved most. I need to escape the city, she'd often say with a chuckle. I belong with my mountains. That summer in mid-July, I packed up her ashes and set out for New York. I knew I'd mourn her loss and think of her fondly, but it was her heart, her spirit. It was her I was bringing back to the mountains. Graham's love for adventure was infectious, and I had inherited that passion for the outdoors. The drive was heavy with the solemn task ahead. The journey began with me setting up base at an old log cabin in Keene Valley. Amidst the rustling leaves and crisp morning air, I realized the weight of my mission, a duty to a beloved grandmother whose memories had colored my existence. Over the next few days, I began my hikes, driving to the trails early in the morning when the mist still clung lazily to the peaks. Every step, rustle, and bird song seemed to match my heartbeat as I ventured deeper into the Adirondacks. As I hiked, memories of Graham's stories washed over me. The towering pines, chirping crickets, and rustling leaves felt like reminders of her, strengthening my spirit and resolve. I spent whole days exploring trails she'd mentioned in her stories, basking in the silence and the solitude that the mountainous expanse granted me. On one hike, I reached a clearing that overlooked a secluded, shimmering lake nestled between the peaks. This was it. This was where Graham had spoken of spreading her ashes, where she felt completely at one with nature. As the sun began to set, I opened the urn. The summer wind, scented with pine and wildflowers, took the ashes and spread them across the lake and into the wilderness. As I watched the last remnants of her earthly existence blend with the elements, my heart throbbed with a vibrant mixture of emotions: loss, love, peace, and a sense of profound fulfillment. I knew then that this is where she had always meant to be, within her beloved mountains, free and unfettered. As I headed back to the cabin, the woods around me felt different. The forest's fresh scent was replaced by a musky, sour smell. There was a shift in the undercurrent of the forest symphony, an unease that prickled my senses. Then I heard it, a piercingly shrill cry that echoed through the mountainous expanse. It wasn't a sound I could attribute to any animal, known or unknown, and it sent a chill running down my spine, turning the beautiful landscape to something eerie and foreboding. In the silence that followed, I stood rooted to the spot. My breath hitched. I felt watched, a sensation that had me spinning around attempting to pierce the twilight gloom. But all I saw were shadows lengthening under the moonlit sky. All I heard was my heartbeat crashing against my ribcage. My breath turned frosty in the night air, and a deep unease settled. I felt I wasn't alone. Little did I know just how terrifying the evening would turn, and how the memories of this trip would haunt me for the rest of my days. I was about to turn back when something stopped me in my tracks. There in the middle of the path was a deer carcass, partially eaten, rotting and oddly twisted. Its visceral remnants spread around, the off-putting stink of stale death permeating the air. I felt a mix of confusion and instinctual fear. I stared, taken aback by the shocking sight. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement in the tree line. It towered above me, standing almost 9 feet tall. Its aged, dense antlers stood tall amongst the skeletal frame of what could be described as a head. Its face resembled a weathered deer skull, pale with hollows where eyes should be. But oh, those eyes. They weren't vacant holes. They were alive, glowing with a ghastly yellow light that held an eerie pull. The creature's body was a mix of decayed flesh and skeletal bones. Its nauseating stench made my stomach churn. Fear took over, pushing away all logic. Frozen in place, I stared at the creature standing close by. For a moment, time stood still, and silence prevailed. The creature apparently did not see me, or chose to ignore my existence and moved on, its towering figure disappearing into the dense underbrush. I hurried back to the cabin, the once friendly woods now seeming ominous. Back at the cabin, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Lying on the wooden floor, every noise and shadow consumed me with fear. I looked up at the moonlit sky, thinking of Graham and her love for these forests. It now held a different meaning, a different face, one of horror and dread. Throughout the night, I listened to the haunting cries of what I now believed to be a Wendigo. I thought of Graham and wondered if her spirit had protected me, allowed me to see the creature without being seen. At times, I question its authenticity, find myself questioning the reliability of my own memory. But then, I think about the deep-rooted horror I felt, and the visceral reality of the incident resurfaces. Despite the terror, I found that incident brought me closer to my grandmother, that it forged a stronger bond with the mountains she loved. I wondered if her spirit had confronted the Wendigo, reminding me of nature's dual nature. Now, I live with the memory of my encounter, the haunting cries of the Wendigo, and a deep love for the mountains, a gift from my grandmother. I desperately needed some downtime from my hectic life. I decided to reconnect with nature. I booked a rental for a remote cabin in the Montana forest. The isolation and wilderness were refreshing. I loved the idea of a fireplace and a good book. The cabin was next to a river and surrounded by pines. It was picture perfect. I was alone, but that was the goal. No cell service, barely any electricity, me and my old Labrador Toby. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first few days were uneventful. I spent them exploring the surroundings, hiking and fishing during the day, whiling away the evenings with a book by the fire. Toby loved it too, always eager to snuffle through the underbrush, probably tracking the scent of some rabbit or squirrel. On the fourth night, I sat by the fireplace with an old classic, enjoying the chilly evening. I had made a pot of soup earlier, nice and hearty, full of wild mushrooms I had found earlier that day. Toby lay at my feet, sleeping soundly, or so I thought. Suddenly he growled, clearly sensing something off. I immediately looked up from my book. Toby was an easygoing dog. Apart from squirrels and chipmunks, very few things ruffled him. He was sitting bolt upright now, ears pricked, eyes focused on the cabin's single window. I followed his gaze, squinting to peer out into the blackness. There was only the night and the silhouette of pines against the moonlit sky. Just some nocturnal creature scuttling about, I reasoned. Nothing of concern. I patted my dog consolingly, assuring him there was nothing to worry about, though I was a bit unnerved myself. We went back to our ritual, me trying to focus on the book, Toby still on high alert. About an hour or so later, a strange sort of howl broke the silence. It was unlike anything I'd heard before. It was deep, echoing in the silence of the night. A guttural howl that sent shivers down my spine and turned Toby from alert to truly petrified. He cowered next to me, hackles raised, whining, a far cry from the usually spirited dog. Nervous, I put out the fire and locked the little cabin up tight. Toby and I moved to the upper loft. As I changed into my sleeping clothes, I felt the cabin's vulnerability, sensing the fear practically rolling off of Toby. The howl made my heart race and filled me with dread. I reasoned it might be a wolf, given the location. Comforting my dog, I settled into the cot, reassuring Toby with soft words and gentle strokes. I told myself it was just the sounds of nature. But as sleep eluded me, and I lay awake, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling of distress growing in me. Nor could I ignore the putrid smell that slowly crept in through the wooden walls of the cabin. Rancid, offensive, utterly contaminating. Time seemed to drag on, and just when I thought the night couldn't possibly get worse, The horrific growls started. Far at first, but then closer, outside the cabin. Much, much too close for comfort. The high-pitched cries shattered the silence. It was a sound I couldn't mistake for anything else. The sound of distress. I shot up from the cot, heart pounding in my chest. The sound pitched upward, a scream, then cut off abruptly. The pungent scent in the air turned acrid, condensing fear into something palpable, and all I could think of was someone or something needed help. I mustered my courage, grabbed my torch, and made my way downstairs, Toby on my heels. What I saw from the window was far from what I could have ever anticipated. There it was, towering over 7 feet with broad shoulders, covered in dark coarse fur. The creature was standing on its hind legs, its elongated feet dug into the moist earth. Its facial features were dreadfully uncanny, a manifestation straight out of nightmare fuel. A long snout, sharp as if chiseled, accompanied by a scarred face, skin stretched tight over pronounced brow ridge, and a strong jawline housing long exposed canines. The yellow eyes glinted in the cabin lights, revealing a depth of emotion suggesting its troubles. Stunned, I stood glued at the spot, my breath hitched in my throat. There, outside my cabin, stood the dogman, a creature I dismissed as local folklore. I saw its chest heave, the huff of its breath visible in the cold night, as it growled low, a sound that was deeply unsettling. But there was something else in its eyes, a plea. Torn between fear and confusion, I debated whether to help the creature or flee. Erring on the side of caution, I decided to play it safe. I backed away from the window slowly, making the least amount of noise possible. Toby whimpered as I picked him up, hushed him, and stealthily made our way to the vehicle parked a little way off from the cabin. We drove away from what I had thought was just a mythical creature. Days, weeks, and then months passed after the encounter. My mind often drifted back to that horrifying night, forcing me to face the fact that my retreat wasn't merely an escape from danger, but a denied plea for assistance. Montana's forests, once peaceful for me, now held a sense of unease. The once calming solitude now hinted at hidden creatures. Undeniably, the experience changed my view of the world. Every rustle or snap now suggested the presence of the unknown. The encounter showed me that bravery can be tested by the unknown. I often find myself wondering if the dogman still roams the Montana woods, or if it has ventured farther. I often wonder how things might have changed had I stayed to help. But then again, some questions are better left unanswered. Got a story that happened high up in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. This was about 6 years ago, around the tail end of summer. It was a bright sunny day, with the mountain peaks shining white, and the air feeling incredibly fresh. The landscape was vast and breathtaking. At that time, wasn't like I was out there seeking thrills. I was looking for some peace. Life was a bit rough back east, so I figured just hit the Rockies on my own. Get lost in the quiet. The mountaintop was silent. The only sounds were the whistling wind and the crunch of my footsteps. So, I started my hike early. Packed light, just a bag of trail mix, water, and a map I'd studied the night before. I followed the well-worn trails at first, watching marmots scurry along the rocks, listening to the distant call of eagles. But soon, my curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself wandering off the established trails. As I hiked, a feeling of peacefulness settled over me. I enjoyed the hard climb, the slight burn in my legs, the feeling of the cool wind hitting my face. From time to time, I'd stop to drink water, take in the majestic landscape unfolding around me. I think it was on one of these breaks when I first noticed it, the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. This felt different. The silence was unsettling. It was then that I realized something. The sounds of nature, the calls of the birds, the rustling of the leaves, all were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. That's when I felt a creeping sensation at the back of my neck. I had this eerie feeling of being watched. Despite being in a bright, open area, I couldn't shake off a nagging sensation of unease. I'm a guy who thrives on solitude. I usually relish being alone in wild places, but in that moment it felt wrong. Trying to shake it off, I thought maybe I'd been hiking alone for too long, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the uncomfortable silence and the feeling of being watched continued to linger, and that's when I heard the first sound, a knock. It was distant but distinct against the backdrop of silence. I paused, thinking maybe it was a woodpecker somewhere, but then I heard it again, the same knock, this time a little louder, a little more urgent. That's when I noticed the smell, an acrid odor like spoiled meat combined with a damp, musty scent. I quickly covered my nose, trying not to gag. I had never encountered that smell before. It felt as out of place as I did. In a state of heightened alertness, I continued climbing, deciding to reach a higher vantage point. I made my way to a nearby ridge, hoping to spot something, someone, anything that would explain the unsettling feeling plaguing me. And that's when I saw it, or rather saw the signs of it. A large, powerful, vague silhouette moving swiftly through the woods down below. A rush of fear hit me, almost overshadowing the view. The creature was enormous, far beyond what I had expected. As I stood there stunned, I realized I was dealing with something far beyond what I had ever imagined. After that discovery, my journey felt surreal. I'm a reasonable guy, and I don't take the unexplained lightly. But there I was, lost on a mountainside in Colorado, with an unbelievably colossal, hulking silhouette, disappearing into the wilderness. The putrid smell was inescapable. I tried to think rationally, searching for a logical explanation. I noticed that the creature left behind a trail. Despite my apprehension, I couldn't help but follow the trail out of sheer curiosity. So, I decided to investigate further. I found prints, unnatural prints. They were gargantuan, massive. I have never seen any like it. They didn't match any known animal in these parts. I couldn't make sense of what was before me. All the while, the silence remained. The only signs grounding me to reality were a distant knock and the pungent smell in the air. It was deeply unsettling, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, a deep resonating growl echoed through the trees. Its growl was so deep that I felt it reverberate in the air around me. A chill ran down my spine, and that's when I saw it. A massive figure stood near a tree not far from me. I locked eyes with it, or what seemed to be eyes. Its face was shadowed, with deep-set eyes under a heavy brow, giving it an intense, brooding expression. The creature was covered head to toe in brownish-red hair, gleaming in the sun like hammered bronze. It let out a deep grunt. Our eyes locked onto each other. I was consumed with fear, yet oddly fascinated. Once the shock subsided, I cautiously retreated. It watched, its massive figure towering over the landscape, but noticeably non-aggressive. Before I knew it, the Sasquatch was bounding off effortlessly up the mountain with a powerful grace that contradicted its monstrous physique. It vanished, leaving behind a few tracks in the quiet. I quickly retreated to my campsite. The tranquility of my hike shattered. I spent a restless night, barely sleeping. I'd frequently awaken to my heart racing, met with the stillness of the night and the moonlit mountainside. After a restless night, I decided first thing in the morning to cut my trip short. On my return, I shared the tale sparingly, not knowing how people might react or what they might think of me. After all, who would believe a solitary hiker claiming to have locked eyes with a Sasquatch? Over time, my fear faded, replaced by a sense of wonder and luck for having witnessed something so elusive. There are countless mysteries hidden away in the natural world. The Rockies hold secrets beyond their scenic trails. So, to anyone planning to take the same hike, tread lightly, stay aware, and remember, you're not the only one in the woods. A few years ago, I found myself at one of the most hauntingly beautiful locations on Earth, Point Reyes National Seashore, California. The time was early morning, but the sun was nowhere to be seen. A thick fog had rolled in from the sea, covering the sunlight and spreading a ghostly shade over the landscape. When I arrived, the thick fog muffled sounds. giving a surreal stillness to everything around me. It was eerie, yet invigorating. A landscape shrouded in fog is incredibly humbling. It reminds you of your small place in the enormity of nature. My job involves traveling to beautiful places to capture their essence. There I was, in the fog, camera in hand. In the quiet, I felt inspired not just to document the scene, but to try to capture the lighthouse's isolated mystery in this fog that heightened my senses. The climb to the lighthouse comprised 308 steps, descending the equivalent of 30 stories. The lighthouse seemed even smaller against the vast backdrop of sea and fog. I adjusted my camera gear and began my descent. Each click of my camera seemed to get lost in the dense, quiet fog. I took shots from various angles, captivated by the lighthouse's defiance against the elements. I aimed to contrast the sturdy, man-made lighthouse with the engulfing, unpredictable fog. Perhaps it was the fog or the deep silence, but I sensed an odd energy, a kind of charge in the air that drew me further into the unknown. Every so often, shapes would form in the fog, spectral outlines that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. I wrote it off as the imaginings of an overtaxed mind, trying to impose recognizable shapes on the vast swathes of foggy emptiness. It must have been the deceptive serenity of the place that made me want to whisper, not to disturb the engulfing silence. I was slowly losing track of time, and for a moment there, I felt like the sole witness of a world between the realms of reality and dream. Capturing this scene felt like photographing a grayscale painting, with the lighthouse as a beacon amid the haze. The silence continued, dominating the scene, but it wouldn't last, and that's when I saw it emerge from the dense sheet of white, unlike anything I'd ever witnessed before. Large, almost human-like, but oh, so different in its bearing. They call it the Mothman, I promise. It was as real as the fog it emerged from. It took shape from a mere shadow, its form subtly flickering as though struggling to materialize fully. It seemed as if the fog itself was giving substance to its shadowy form. Its eyes were a fiery red, casting an eerie glow that penetrated the thick fog. No discernible mouth, no visible nose, just those massive red eyes, reflecting a keen intelligence that struck fear into my heart. Attached to a body that, though human-like in its rough form, was smoky gray and alarmingly broad. Leather wings unfolded, unfolding the fog around it. The majesty and terror of it, perched atop the lighthouse, was almost hypnotic. My hand, involuntarily, brought up my camera, as if trying to cope with the strange reality by capturing it. As the lens focused onto it, the creature spoke. Its voice was like a distant ocean rumble, somehow part of the fog yet chillingly distinct. Beware the mirror when the moon is lost. Then, just as it appeared, it vanished back into the fog, leaving behind those haunting words echoing in my ears and a few digital imprints on my memory card. The fog grew suffocating, as if trying to fill the void the creature left behind. I lingered around in dreadful anticipation, but the fog never stirred again, nor did the spectral creature return. There was nothing but the monotonous sound of the sea and the eerie loneliness that surrounded the lighthouse. I was left in a state of horror and disbelief, with only the cryptic warning as my keepsake. I continued to document the lighthouse amidst the fog, but the thrill was gone, replaced by an unnamed dread and a mystery far more captivating than the fog-engulfed lighthouse. The encounter with the Mothman sent me on a quest filled with mystery and unease. I started to dig deeper, pry open the tales of folklore that spoke about this creature, and the ominous warnings it is believed to deliver, desperately trying to decipher the strange riddle. Beware the mirror when the moon is lost. I wondered whether it was a cryptic indication of an impending disaster or an alien perception of human reality. But no answers came, only more questions piled up. Days turned into weeks, then months, making the event feel more like a dream. Perhaps that's what an encounter with the unusual does to one's mind, casting doubt, throwing the inherent notion of reality in turmoil. What remains constant is my quest for answers, traveling to fog-laden corners of the world with just my camera. Recalling that day sends chills down my spine. especially when the lines between reality and the uncanny blur. Whenever the moon disappears behind the clouds, unease takes hold of me, a reminder of my encounter and the Mothman's cryptic message. If the creature comes out of the fog again, I hope to be braver, more prepared for the encounter, and whatever calamity its arrival might portend. But for now, all that's left from the strange encounter that day is a haunting memory and an unsolved riddle. Birdwatching for many might seem mundane, but for me, it's a form of meditation. The anticipation of spotting a new bird, the quick, cerulean flash of a bluebird darting through foliage, the silent glide of an owl as it cuts through the twilight, all of it thrills me. The vast green expanses of Congaree National Park in South Carolina provide the perfect backdrop. For as long as I can remember, I've dreamed of ticking off a checklist of birds that call this park home. For my birthday, I treated myself to some time off and booked a cabin near the park. I grabbed my binoculars and my birdwatching journal and had set off on my personal expedition. The early morning sun filtered through the foliage, casting shadows around me. I was making a slow, calculated path through the park when I spotted my first rare sight, a yellow-crowned night heron. Capturing a photo, I felt a surge of excitement. I was in my element, hoping the dawn would reveal new species. Perched on a raised embankment, I watched the birds flit by peacefully. A cardinal darted around, a flash of bright red against the backdrop of green and brown. I looked through the viewfinder of my camera, adjusting the aperture to capture a vivid, clear shot of the cardinal as it settled momentarily upon a branch. In my pursuit, I trekked deeper into the park, moving as silent as possible. I found a spot protected by a circling embrace of towering trees, where I set up my binoculars. Sunshine filtered through the canopy, illuminating the moss on the tree bark. I sat on a fallen log, notebook at the ready, binoculars positioned carefully, and I watched and listened. Birdwatching requires attention to sound. You start to learn the symphony of bird calls, each trill or whistle unique. By mid-afternoon, the forest echoed with crows, finches, and the distant sound of a woodpecker. But amidst the familiar, there was the unfamiliar. From afar, there came a strange clicking sound, like a tongue clicking on the roof of a mouth. It was quiet but rhythmic, a sound I hadn't associated with any bird I knew. My curiosity piqued. This could be a new species, a notion that alone was exhilarating. So, I packed up and began to move toward the direction of the sound. As I ventured further, the clicking grew louder. Throughout, I couldn't shake off a growing sense of unease. The normally peaceful park somehow felt different, transformed. The cheerful chirping of the birds had fallen noticeably silent as I neared the sound, replaced by an unsettling stillness that laid heavy on the surrounding woods. I arrived at a secluded spot in the shadow of a mammoth oak tree. The clicking was louder here, an eerie rhythm that echoed faintly from a nearby thicket. Squinting against the dusk that was starting to settle, I noticed something moving in the underbrush. In that tense moment between the familiar and the unknown, a deep sense of dread gripped me. Something felt distinctly wrong about this situation. Yet, the possibility of a new species kept me going. Ignoring the growing chill of impending danger, I edged closer, camera at the ready. As I looked through the undergrowth, I saw something unsettling. To my horror, the source of the clicking sounds wasn't a bird at all. Just a few feet away, nestled amongst a tangle of brambles, was a creature. I can't describe how it truly looked. Its body, long and bizarrely lean, was unlike anything I'd ever seen in nature. Its skin was pale, almost skeletal. But what unsettled me the most was how human-like it appeared. Unlike the usual four-legged inhabitants of the park, this creature was on all fours, its bony arms and legs arranged in a grotesque adaptation of a crawl. Then I saw its face, where a mouth should have been gaped a large dark hole, and in the twilight, something indistinguishable seemed to click inside. Its eyes bore into me, two large, lifeless black orbs that chilled me to my very core. And then, in an abrupt, horrifying movement, the creature took off. Too shell-shocked to react, I could only watch as it swiftly climbed up a tree. It moved unlike any animal I'd seen before, with a bone-chilling mix of human dexterity and animalistic agility. After it left, there was a heavy silence, with only the memory of its clicking sound echoing in my ears. Frozen in place, I tried to process what I'd just seen. When I got back to my senses, I dashed back to my cabin, blind to the myriad of birds I'd initially sought. My heartbeat thundering louder than the rustling forest leaves. The familiar sight of the cabin offered me little relief. In the cabin, the encounter replayed in my mind. The park, which I loved, now felt threatened by this menacing presence, filling me with fear. Yet, deep inside, I also felt a spark of odd fascination. Despite being terrified, I was also intrigued by the creature. The remainder of my stay was tinged with a sense of foreboding. The normally harmonious symphony of bird calls was now a sinister soundtrack. The formerly charming thickets, potential hiding spots for that horrifying creature. The crawler had not reappeared, and for that, I was thankful. Leaving the park, I felt a strange mix of relief and a peculiar loss. One thing's for sure, though. My bird-watching trips had gained a new companion, an uninvited one. The dread, the thrill of the wild, the confrontation with the unknown, all dwarfed under the shadow of that menacing creature. It was no bird, but it was undeniably a part of the park's chorus now. Its eerie clicks became a haunting anthem as night fell. A new species indeed, but one I'd hoped to never encounter. But such is nature, at times breathtakingly beautiful, at other times chillingly brutal.